Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for a Tuesday, August the 17th, 2021. I think perhaps my favorite story coming out of the debacle in Kabul, this is from RT, Johnny Tickle, the Western-backed former Afghan leader, Ashraf Ghani, departed his country with so much money that it couldn't all fit on his helicopter, and he was forced to leave some cash at the airport, the Russian embassy in Kabul has said. Speaking to RIA Novosti, its spokesman Nikita Ishchenko dubbed Ghani's escape an eloquent characterization of the fall of the regime. 4 cars were stuffed with money. They tried to fit all the money on the helicopter, but not all of it fit. Some of the money was left lying on the tarmac, he explained, without elaborating how he obtained the information. Like something out of an Evelyn Waugh novel, Ghani became president of Afghanistan in September 2014, marking the first time in the country's history that power was democratically transferred. Since his election, Ghani has enjoyed a close relationship with the U.S., which has pumped almost $1 trillion into the country. According to a 2019 study by Brown University, Washington has spent around $978 billion in Afghanistan and Pakistan since 2001. And what did they get for that money? This is from Hannah Blow at Breitbart. Support for America's withdrawal from Afghanistan has plummeted by double digits over the last few months, particularly in the wake of the Taliban seizing control over the U.S.-backed Afghan government, a Politico Morning Consult survey found. According to the survey conducted August 13th to 16th among 1,999 registered voters, 49% of voters support the withdrawal. That number reflects a 20% drop from the 69% who said the same in April. A majority of Democrats, 69%, support withdrawal, but just less than a third of Republicans, 31%, agree. I guess they hadn't been paying much attention. I have been greatly enjoying the Spurg rage from the neocons and the never Trumpers. Oh, Afghanistan, so very, very important. Our valued national allies, our closest allies, maybe even closer than Israel, except that you must have noticed that there was hardly anything in the media about Afghanistan for years. If it was so important, why didn't we have all these stories, heartwarming stories about the great work America was doing in Afghanistan? That's because nobody cared, except for those who were paid to. This is again from Breitbart. Joel Pollack, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, told reporters Tuesday that the Biden administration had planned for all contingencies in Afghanistan, repeating a line that President Joe Biden used in his remarks to the nation Monday. On Monday, Biden said that his administration had been, quote, moving quickly to execute the plans we had put in place to respond to every constituency, including contingency, including the rapid collapse we're seeing now. This did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated, unquote. Well, that's one way to put it. It doesn't appear that the U.S. government was ready for all contingencies, given the chaos, the humiliating chaos that we saw on the ground at Kabul airport. In July, President Biden said that a Taliban takeover of the entire country was highly unlikely. Sullivan was a key figure in spreading the Russia collusion hoax, falsely briefing reporters about links between Donald Trump and Russia, and testifying to Congress that he believed former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn had been involved in a conspiracy with the Russian government. Sullivan now occupies Flynn's former job at the White House. And I'll just add that given this man is a political hack through and through, how he got this job is an interesting question. I suppose you've all seen at least part of Biden's speech yesterday. He was angry at Afghanistan, angry at the Afghan people. Very, very strange speech. Oh, and you may have seen that Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, said today that he had consulted with Hillary Clinton over what was happening in Afghanistan. Hillary Clinton was once the U.S. Secretary of State, but of course, she hasn't been for some time. This is from Charlie Spearing at Breitbart. The White House revealed President Joe Biden has not spoken with world leaders since the Taliban took control of Kabul, the capital city of Afghanistan. He has not yet spoken with any other world leaders, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said in response to a question from CNN's Caitlin Collins during a press briefing Tuesday. Sullivan said he, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and senior members of the White House were engaged with their foreign counterparts throughout the crisis. Right now, the main issue is an operational issue, Sullivan said, noting the administration would continue working with other countries to evacuate their citizens from Afghanistan. White House Press Secretary not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki, also defended the president not making calls to world leaders, noting that the president's focus, very satirical, remained on operational efforts in Afghanistan, adding that it includes coordination at a lower level than leaders and heads of state. What happened to all that talk about America being back and repairing relations with America's allies? All very amusing. Oh, look, here is another powerful man blubbing in public. This is also from RT. British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace was visibly distraught and appeared to choke back tears as he was explaining that his government will likely not be able to evacuate everyone it wants to from Taliban-seized Kabul. Wallace spoke to LBC on Monday to describe the ongoing effort to fly out holders of British passports and allied Afghan citizens from Kabul International Airport. It seemed to me that the only time that a man should be seen crying in public, I suppose, at the funeral of a wife or child, or perhaps mother or father, is on Remembrance Day when, you wipe away a manly tear. But no, we have crying policemen testifying in front of Congress, crying congressmen. So people are asking the question, why did this happen? And I'll get to that in a minute. But I suppose a more interesting question would be, how important is this? There are some people who believe that it's, twilight of the American empire. I'm not so sure about that. Is anyone going to be held responsible for this? Doesn't look like it, does it? And that is the new tradition. After 9/11, I was certain that we would see hundreds, if not thousands, of people sacked. Nobody was sacked because Joe Biden says the buck stops with me, but no, it doesn't. No one is held responsible for anything anymore. And perhaps if Machiavelli had been listened to, this would not have happened. It would appear that there were more translators in Afghanistan than actual members of the Afghan National Army. Let's see what Machiavelli has to say about mercenaries. I say, therefore, that the arms with which a prince defends his state are either his own, or they are mercenaries, auxiliaries, or mixed. Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous, and if one holds his state based on these arms, he will stand neither firm nor safe, for they are disunited, ambitious, and without discipline, unfaithful, valiant before friends, cowardly before enemies, and have neither the fear of God nor fidelity to men, and one's own destruction is deferred only so long as the attack is. For in peace, one is robbed by them, and in war by the enemy. The fact is, they have no other attraction or reason for keeping the field than a trifle of stipend, which is not sufficient to make them willing to die for you. They are ready enough to be your soldiers whilst you do not make war, but if war comes, they take themselves off or run from the foe. I wish to demonstrate further the infelicity of mercenary arms. The mercenary captains are either capable men or they are not. If they are, you cannot trust them, because they always aspire to their own greatness, either by oppressing you, who are their master, or others contrary to your intentions. But if the captain, that is, the leader of the mercenaries, is not skillful, you are ruined in the usual way, i.e., you will lose the war. Speaking of Spurg rage, Tom Nichols, leading Never Trumper, and author of the book Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy, and he teaches at the Naval War College. You know whose fault it is? It's your fault, America. Yeah, he has a piece in The Atlantic yesterday. Afghanistan is your fault. The American people now has what it wanted. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Kabul has fallen. Americans will now exercise their usual partisan outrage for a few weeks, and then Afghanistan, like everything else in a nation with an attention span not much longer than a fast food commercial, will be forgotten. In the meantime, American citizens will separate into their usual camps and identify all of the obvious causes and culprits except for one: themselves. Many Americans will bristle at the idea that this defeat overseas can be laid at their feet. When U.S. forces had to endure the misery of the retreat from North Korea back to the 38th parallel, no one made the argument that it happened because of the voters. No one turned to the American people during the fall of Saigon and said, "This is on you." So why would I do that now? Much of what happened in Korea and Vietnam, ultimately constituting a tie and a loss, if we are to be accurate, was beyond the control of the American public. Boys were drafted and sent into battle, sometimes in missions never intended to be revealed to the public. Afghanistan was different. This was a war that was immensely popular at the outset and mostly conducted in full view of the American public. Oh, come off it. He can't seriously mean that. The problem was that once the initial euphoria wore off, the public wasn't much interested in it. Coverage in print media remained solid, but cable news coverage of Afghanistan dropped off quickly, especially once a new adventure was launched in Iraq. In post-2001 America, it became fashionable to speak of war weariness, but citizens who were not in the military or part of a military family or community did not have to endure even minor inconveniences, much less shoulder major burdens such as a draft, a war tax, or resource shortages. The soldiers who served overseas in the first years of major operations soon felt forgotten. "America's not at war" was a common refrain among the troops. "We're at war. America's at the mall." Well, Lyndon Baines Johnson decided that Vietnam would not be fought like a traditional war, in that there would be no big tax increases to pay for it. There would be no resource shortages. And there was a draft, but that ended by, 1971? So this is not new. Tom Nichols, Major Tom, as I like to call him, seems to be arguing that America should become Sparta. And now those same Americans have the full withdrawal from Afghanistan they apparently want. Some 70% of the public supports a pullout. Not that they care that intensely about it. As the foreign policy scholar Stephen Biddle recently observed, the war is practically an afterthought in U.S. politics. Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden all ran on getting out of the war, and now we're out. What the public does care about, however, is using Afghanistan as raw material for cheap patriotism and partisan attacks on every president since 2001. After the worst attack on U.S. soil, Americans had no real interest in adult conversation about the reality of anti-terrorist operations in so harsh an environment of Afghanistan, which might have entailed a presence there long beyond 20 years. Forever wars. Don't you just love them? nor did they want to think about whether draining the swamp and modernizing and developing Afghanistan, which would mean a lot more than a few elections, was worth the cost and effort. Well, the Soviet Union used a lot of people, a lot of man hours, and a lot of money in an attempt to modernize and develop Afghanistan. And you can see some of that in Adam Curtis's documentary Bitter Lake, which I highly recommend. The Russians weren't in Afghanistan simply to kill people and take territory. They believed in their mission too. And how did that end up? Nichols continues, maybe it would have been worth it, or maybe such a project was impossible. Now you tell us. We'll never know for certain because American political and military leaders only tried pieces of several strategies, never a coherent whole, mostly to keep the costs and casualties down, to keep the war off the front pages and away from a public that didn't want to hear about it. Yes, the Washington Post's attempts to create a Pentagon Papers vibe around a set of revelations that were not nearly as shocking as the secrets of Vietnam. No, for instance, generals, the Department of Defense spending a fortune building an army that was a phantom army. And what happened to these generals? They all got promoted. A serious people, the kind of people we once were, would have made serious choices long before this current debacle was upon them. They would be grimly assessing risk and preparing both overseas and at home for the reality of a terrorist nation making its way back onto the international map. What to also suggest, probably a good idea not to import people from that part of the world. But America has magic dirt, as John Derbyshire says. So a policy of bombing the hell out of people who are not a threat to us and then importing the survivors and hoping they don't hold a grudge. Yeah. How is that going to work? But before we move on, before we head back to the mall, boo! Before we resume posting memes, we got to be Sparta. And before we return to bickering with each other about whether we should have to mask up at Starbucks, guess who is a lockdown enthusiast? Major Tom. Let us remember that this day came about for one reason and one reason only, because it is what we wanted. What an absurd, pissy little man. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Gamion, Anran, Dan, Dionysus, Dawn from Beyond. Picasso 88, Buddy, Chogokin 666, Steve. Why not officially switch to a 4-day stream? Yeah, I don't know. Well, a couple of things happened yesterday. I wanted to think about what had happened. I don't like to just, talk off the top of my head. And the second thing that happened was I lost my bank card. And that resulted in a great deal of panic on my behalf. It turns out that I had left it at a Shoppers Drug Mart earlier in the day. And when I went there and asked, hoping against hope, do you have a bank card? Van City? What color is it? Red. Pulls it out of a box. I give him my name and I get my bank card back. That worked out nicely. No sleep to, hello to No Sleep Till Breezewood of Pennsylvania. De Boreas, hello, Canadian elections. I'm going to have something to say about that. Steve says, Afghanistan falls, neocons hit hardest. Pal Picasso, Kevin, do you like to clap back at your adversaries and detractors? I don't like that phrase, but I guess that I do. Of course, I don't. My Twitter account is rather constrained, partially blocked. Palcasso 88 says Ontario's chief latrine wallet says fall winter will be hard because of Delta and fourth wave. He had to make some tough choices. Anwar says, anyone see that KMG retweet of a 5-month-old pregnant woman being refused by her cardiologist because she wasn't vaxxed? 5 months pregnant and having heart issues, and the SOB won't see her. Debrea says, so what's the probability on Trudeau losing? Well, I don't like really to make these short-term political predictions I've mentioned before. The media is engaged in full-on manufacturing consent. Oh, it's just a question of how big a victory Trudeau wins, because everyone hates Erin O'Toole. Also, vaccine mandates. And $500 one-time payment to all senior citizens, which is no way can be considered a bribe, in the same way that Erin O'Toole's berserk plan to somehow stop collecting GST or VAT in the month of December for 1 month only. One thing, Jagmeet Singh. The media was in love with this guy from the beginning because he's a Sikh. That's simple. And they are still pushing this guy, despite the fact that I don't think that he's very popular because he looks like a cartoon villain. And if the NDP does badly, then Trudeau, it would be much easier for Trudeau to get his majority. Hello to Matt Forney. The fall of Afghanistan will be seen as the first fallen domino of the GAE. Cabal is a historic disaster, absolute chaos and panic, says Steve. Well, no, look, I know that Biden has, the media seems to be a little bit miffed with him. But when the National Security Advisor can say, oh, no, it's all done according to plan, and this guy wasn't shouted down or laughed out of the room. Debrea says that's not a doctor. There is no way anyone with self-esteem would refuse a patient because COVID, let alone an MD. But he says Afghanistan will soon be forgotten. News cycle moves on. Well, certainly if Stephen Colbert has anything to say about it, and I will get to him. This is the only way leaving Afghanistan was ever going to turn out. Just as well be done with it now. Good on Joe for once, says John S. Joe Ken 666 says the bodies falling from those C-47s are very powerful propaganda, pushing choppers off the deck of carriers. Powerful. Are these people really so stupid that they believe that they could grab onto the side of a plane, like, grabbing onto the side of a vehicle? And they couldn't seriously believe that. Could they? Chogakin 666 says negative. The Soviets withdrew in an orderly fashion, not at all pell-mell. Every confident briefing they gave about Afghan progress was a total lie, says Steve. Your view is boomer tier Biden cope, says Chogakin 666. I don't know who that is in reference to. Look, I've said it before, I'll say it again. The only way that a war in Afghanistan could have been won by the Soviets or by the Americans and the Canadians and the British and the Australians and the rest who were there, don't forget Canada was there for 13 useless years, is genocide. Pure and simple. Since I'm not in favor of genocide, that would mark me as an opponent of the war from the the occupation from the very beginning. What are the odds China makes a move on Taiwan now, says Popcasso 88? Well, that's what a lot of people are talking about. Again, was it ever seriously believed that the United States would use nuclear weapons against China if it invaded Taiwan, knowing that China has the capacity to launch nuclear weapons at the United States? Nichols sounds a little salty, says Dan. Okay. Am I wrong for thinking Major Tom is like a real-life parody of John Goodman's character in Big Lebowski? Says no sleep till Breezewood, PA. Kontiki Relay says this is the equivalent of the management of Kew Gardens losing control of a grass cutter and shredding every single plant and crashing through all the greenhouses, destroying everything. Big win. Withdrawing military forces before evacuating friendlies shows complete ineptitude, says Chogokin 666. And, okay, let's get back to it here. They won't fight for their country, but brave enough to hang on to a damn military aircraft, says Oscar Toe. Okay, that is John Milius in Lebowski. That's what they say. Now for more Spurg rage. Terry Glavin, who is the epitome of the angry Paddy with his relentless oikophobia, he is very angry. Very, very angry. Afghanistan falls into darkness, and admit it or not, this is what the West wanted. For all the American hand-wringing and whining, there were only about 2,400 U.S. troops in Afghanistan when Biden was elected. Yes, but it's rather like the situation that Edward Luttwak describes in his excellent book, Coup d'etat. In a great many African countries, you hear of a central government. Well, the central government controls the presidential palace and the airport and the highway that links them and nothing else. And that was the situation in Afghanistan because the Taliban just shows up in town after town after town in Afghanistan and says, we're in charge now. And the people there said, well, okay. That simple. It was widely and reasonably understood to be the worst American foreign policy humiliation in decades. The catastrophe in Afghanistan seems to have unfolded in a matter of mere days. And from the standpoint of Americans across the political spectrum, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces appears to have simply run away at the first sight of advancing hooligans. But anyone paying attention could have seen this coming. The White House was warned. Oh, was it now? All of these anonymous spooks are telling the newspaper, oh, we warned them. We warned them. As Tucker Carlson pointed out, I believe yesterday, the CIA has been wrong about everything forever. They can't see the nose in front of their face. For a decade, the one consistent message Afghans have been hearing from Washington, you will accommodate the Taliban, you will share power with the Taliban, your embryonic democracy can die in the womb for all we care. Oh dear, oh dear. The ANDSF was left with nothing to fight for. Glavin was pushing this, Canada-Afghanistan Friendship Committee? I wonder who paid. I wonder who paid for that. We're supposed to be shocked by all this. It just goes to show, you will have been told by now that U.S. President Joe Biden is callous and unfit for office. Or you'll hear it's just that Biden was saddled with the rash timetable drawn up by Donald Trump and it was already in motion and unstoppable. But along with the usual invocations of forever wars, blood and treasure, someone else's fight, no military solution, and all those other cliches, which just happen to be true, we're supposed to quietly accept the filthiest lie of all, that the Afghans themselves are at fault. Well, the Afghan National Army, look, these are people who took money against their own country from foreigners. They sold out their own country for money. And see Machiavelli above. And he goes, let's see. It had been a desperate and difficult struggle over the past 20 years, but Afghans had built the basis for an Islamic democracy. How daft one must be in order to believe that. It's been only 20 years since the UN Security Council first authorized a military and state-building project in the smoking tomb that Afghanistan had become by the time the Taliban were chased out after 9/11. Nearly 8 decades after the Second World War, the U.S. still has 50,000 soldiers in Japan, 35,000 in Germany, and 12,000 in Italy. Nearly 7 decades after the Korean Peninsula was bifurcated after the UN authorized intervention in that country, the U.S. still has 26,000 soldiers stationed in South Korea. Well, as George McGovern said in 1972, come home, America. Glavin concludes Afghans cannot be blamed for the terrifying darkness that has been allowed to fall on their country again. This is not what they wanted. Whether the liberal democracies of the West will ever be capable of admitting it or not, the catastrophe of these past few days in Afghanistan is what we wanted. And one way or another, we will all be made to pay. Wow, is that a threat or a promise, Terry? Bill Kristol, again, not very happy. But, let's see. David French weighs in. Laura Ingraham asks, is it really our responsibility to welcome thousands of refugees from Afghanistan? Yes, the answer is yes. And Major Tom was going on about what the Testaments, the Old Testament, the New Testament, both, that requires this, requires it. But Bill Crystal seems to be angrier with Tucker Carlson than with anyone else, because Tucker Carlson is telling the truth about this. Do you remember when the media, the elite, was all over Donald Trump, supposedly because he railed at the generals? Why can't you win a war? Why are you useless? Why do we give you so much money and you never accomplish anything? Maybe some people would change their minds about this. But, let's see. Tucker Carlson said, if history is any guide, and it's always a guide, we'll see many refugees from Afghanistan resettle in our country in coming months, probably in your neighborhood. And over the next decade, that number may swell to the millions. So first we invade, and then we're invaded. Bill Crystal responds, the probably in your neighborhood is the tell of when it needed, that this is simply an attempt to stir up nativist bigotry. Yeah. So both Canada and the United States have imported rather large numbers of Somalis after both our countries' disastrous intervention in their civil war. And how has that worked out? Well, we have Somali gang problems now. And the last time I was in Edmonton, the capital of Alberta, downtown, I saw many Somali men leaning against walls, both outside and inside, and looking sullen and murderous. Afghan refugees better than Fox News anchors, says Bill Crystal. Wow, he really seems to hate Americans. I don't know whether he hates Americans quite as much as Major Tom does, but perhaps that's a distinction without a difference. Yeah, we love those translators. How many? 10,000, 20,000, 80,000, 250,000? It's obviously these are paper jobs. Paper jobs. They wanted a bolt hole. Now apparently they're going to get it at our expense. Stephen Colbert likens Trump voters to the Taliban, quote, why should our soldiers be fighting radicals in a civil war in Afghanistan? We've got our own on Capitol Hill, unquote. How many Americans would have to be sacrificed, killed by the military for Stephen Colbert to be happy? 1,000, 5,000, 500,000, 1 million? Because this is close to murderous talk. Beckett Adams comments, court jester trying to keep the decrepit emperor happy. Oh, and Liz Cheney has weighed in. Because you might remember who her father is. And Cheney, of course, was one of the architects of the disaster in Afghanistan. Eric Brakey said the war was won 10 years ago when U.S. soldiers put a bullet in the head of Osama bin Laden. Everything since has been pointless warfare that can never be won because there are no stated conditions for victory. Liz Cheney wants America to be an occupying empire forever. Michael Tracy comments, it would never occur to Liz Cheney that if making any attempt to extract the U.S. from a 20-year-long conflict is necessarily calamitous, then maybe the true calamity was the mission itself. Will Bunch commented, when you're not aware that Darth Vader is your father. And a lot of people were much angrier than that. Paul Telfer commented, the Cheney calamity, hell of a family biz, Liz. A very amusing column from a place I wouldn't have expected to find one. This is by Andrew Stiles at Washington Free Beacon. American triumph, the most inclusive national embarrassment in history. Disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal engineered by impressive array of female BIPOC officials. The U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan has quickly become the most embarrassing national security debacle since the Vietnam War. Perhaps more importantly, however, the debacle is one of the most inclusive of its kind in American history. The Biden administration's Afghanistan policy may have failed in the conventional sense, but it was remarkably successful in terms of the gender and racial diversity of the individuals responsible for that failure. Many will die as a result, but blame for their deaths will be shared among an oppressive array of female and BIPOC officials. All in all, this was a triumph of American exceptionalism. Vice President Kamala Harris, for example, was reportedly the last person in the room with President Joe Biden when he made the decision to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. Harris, a female BIPOC of Tamil Indian and Afro-Jamaican descent, is also in charge of the Biden administration's failed effort to secure the southern border. Harris's chief spokeswoman, Simone Sanders, is also a prominent BIPOC. This is a woman who has shaved her head, and it's got little things drawn into it. I really can't imagine why women do that, but there we are. But back to the Free Beacon. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is the first African American to serve in that position and the first to preside over a military defeat of such extraordinary magnitude. Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, is the first woman to oversee an epic intelligence failure after U.S. spy agencies estimated the Taliban would overrun Kabul within 90 days of the U.S. withdrawal. It happened in 72 hours. Haines used to host regular erotica night events at a bookstore in Baltimore, and I looked it up, and it's true. Another important figure in Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan is Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, the former director of Emily's List, who served as lead negotiator for the Iran nuclear deal. She was joined by Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary for State for Political Affairs. Nuland prepared at Choate Rosemary Hall, graduated from Brown University, and served as a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. She is also a woman who has defended Chinese propaganda. Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, provided invaluable representation as a person of color with a vagina. Alejandro Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security, was a critical voice from the Latinx community as he oversaw the administration's efforts to provide visas to military interpreters and other Afghan refugees. Those efforts, of course, have been severely compromised by the Taliban's rapid conquest. Their blood, however, will be on the most diverse set of hands in the history of American decision-making. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki is conveniently out of the office until August 22nd, but has been both a fearless defender of the administration's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and a stern critic of the Taliban. Last week, for example, she warned that the militant group has to make an assessment about what they want their role to be in the international community. In addition to being a female social media influencer, Psaki is also a proud member of the underrepresented ginger American community. Biden himself brings a diverse perspective to his administration by representing a community near octogenarians in cognitive decline that is often underrepresented at the highest levels of government and in corporate America, albeit for obvious reasons. His is a valuable perspective that deserves to be included in our body politic. As candidate for president in 2020, Biden made clear he would accept zero responsibility for a Taliban takeover in Afghanistan and the subsequent suffering of the country's female population. Afghan women should take this point into account before blaming the Biden administration for the brutal repression they are about to endure. Instead of complaining, perhaps they should celebrate the extraordinary female representation among the American officials who engineered this monumental human rights disaster. Biden's efforts to prioritize diversity at home may already be inspiring a new generation of Afghan leaders to embrace Western standards of inclusive progress. On Sunday, for example, a Taliban spokesman expressed his fellow terrorists' commitment to an open, inclusive Islamic government in Afghanistan. Huzzah! Oh, by the way, I was quite taken when Tucker Carlson referred to President Biden as a senile credit card pusher from Delaware. That is le mot juste, or a generic bullseye. as James Burnham would have said. And we have a number of laments and explanations about what has gone wrong, and I'll look briefly at several of them. Again, I just want to remind people, though, that, oh, yeah, Afghanistan. Remember Afghanistan? We've completely forgotten Afghanistan. Man, we really care about Afghanistan. Not true. James Kunstler's column yesterday is called Strange Days Ahead. And of course, there is a picture of the fall of Kabul 2021 and the fall of Saigon 1975, and an identical model of helicopter is evacuating people from a roof. He begins with a quotation from Sean Davis, the editor of The Federalist. If American Airlines were in charge, they would have blamed all the cancellations on weather and then given everyone's checked luggage to the Taliban. Kunstler begins, I guess we had to find out the hard way that Afghanistan is not like Nebraska. Let others be cruel about it, and there's plenty of that right now elsewhere. The last ostensible hegemon who tried occupying the place before us was the Soviet Union, which discovered painfully that Afghanistan was not much like its Kemerovo Oblast either. And shortly after withdrew its troops in 1989, the Soviet Union commenced to collapse, which prompts one to wonder how much of the USA of 2021 is like the Soviet Union of those years. Well, we've become an ossified administrative nomenclatura of deep state flunkies, as the Soviets were, and lately we're just as lawless as they used to be constitution-wise, e.g. the abolition of property rights via the CDC's rent moratorium, the prolonged jailing and solitary confinement of January 6 political prisoners, the introduction of internal passports. The USA is running on fumes economically, as the Soviets were. Our dominant party leadership has aged into an embarrassing gerontocracy. Is it our turn to collapse? Of course, the domestic situation in our land has not been so fraught and overwrought since 1861. Everything is politicized, which is to say, uses a truncheon to beat up adversaries, and let's face it, mostly in the sense of left against right. This is especially true for the COVID-19 soap opera, which more and more pits the sanctimoniously vaccinated progressives against the recalcitrant conservative no-vax free choicers. And then he says something which I can't repeat because I don't want to be kicked off YouTube. Since when did the American left become so pro-tyranny, and how did that even happen? I have friends and relatives, Kunstler relates, I'm sure you do too, who knocked themselves out in the 1960s protesting against the war, the government, the FBI, and the CIA, who fought in the streets for free speech and raged against official propaganda, and today they can't get enough of coercing, punishing, brainwashing, and canceling their fellow citizens. They're going so far now as to engineer their vicious narrative to brand their opponents as domestic terrorists. Think that's going to work? Well, I suppose we shall find out. It's a good piece on frontpagemag.com. Afghanistan didn't fall, it never existed. Yes, Afghanistan is not a nation in any usage that makes any sense. It's a bunch of warring tribes who essentially have been at war with each other, well, as long as there's been history. Afghanistan's collapse. Did U.S. intelligence get it wrong? ABC News asks, Afghanistan is your fault. Barks Tom Nichols at The Atlantic. Why Afghan forces so quickly laid down their arms, Politico ponders. Oh, by the way, before I forget, someone suggested to Terry Glavin that the reason for the bug out from Kabul was Islamophobia. And Terry Glavin's response was, could be. Dems are the real Islamophobes. Too funny. There's one thing that the Taliban's conquest of Afghanistan is good for, is more media hot takes. Afghan didn't fall because it never existed. The Afghan army laid down its arms because it also never existed. And not just because many of the 300,000 soldiers were imaginary. Its Pashtun members surrounded through their fellow Taliban Pashtuns or fled to Iran or Uzbekistan, depending on their tribal or religious affiliations, which, unlike Afghanistan, are very real. The Afghan army was there because we spent $90 billion on it, much like Afghanistan with its president, its constitution, and its elections existed because we spent a fortune on it. When we left, the president fled, the army collapsed, and Afghanistan, the musical, closed in Kabul. Afghanistan isn't a country. It's a Stone Age brigadoon of quarreling tribes, ethnic groups, Islamic denominations, and warlords manned by young men with old Russian and American rifles. Unlike the fiction of a democratic Afghanistan, this is something they will die for. And in the coming years, you will see some of those soldiers who laid down their guns fighting and dying for tribes and warlords, even fighting the Taliban in the real endless war. The forever war isn't something we invented after 9/11. Afghanistan has always been at war. Americans are impressed that the Taliban held out for 20 years. They shouldn't be. There is no time in Afghanistan. 2 decades of war are horrifyingly incomprehensible to Americans. To Afghans, it's the way things have always been. And the forever war will go on endlessly. The good news is it is no longer our problem. No, wait, it is our problem because we're going to be bringing hundreds of thousands of them, maybe millions of them, to the West. Mark Stein, who I guess is a recovering neoconservative, he has a piece on his website called The Scale of Humiliation. To reprise a line from a decade-old column of mine, Afghanistan is about Afghanistan if you're Afghan or Pakistani, but if you're Russian or Chinese or Iranian or European, Afghanistan is about America. That's the point to remember. If you're an Afghan schoolgirl, today is the fall of Kabul. Elsewhere in the chancelleries of allies and enemies alike, it's the fall of America. Even by their usual wretched standards, the world's most somnolent media are struggling to stay up to speed on the story. Here's the scoop from USA Today. Taliban's Afghanistan advance tests Biden's America is back. Foreign policy promise. You don't say. Did he misread the prompter or mishear the guy in his ear? America's on its back, surely. But don't worry, the world's most lavishly overfunded intelligence community is on the case. Kabul could fall to the Taliban within 90 days, U.S. intelligence warns. Thank you, geniuses. That was Thursday. So it turned out to be well within 90 hours, which is close enough for U.S. intelligence work. To modify Hillary Clinton, Stein continues, what difference at this point would it make if the U.S. government simply laid off its entire intelligence community? Indeed, what difference would it make if it closed down its military? Obviously, it would present a few midlife challenges for its corrupt Pentagon bureaucracy, since that many generals on the market for defense lobbyist gigs and board directorships all at once would likely depress the going rate. But other than that, a military that accounts for 40% of the planet's military spending can't perform either of the functions for which one has an army. It can't defeat overseas enemies, and it's not permitted to defend the country, as we have seen on the Rio Grande. So what's the point? But if a nation doesn't have an army to defend it, 250,000 foreign invaders could just walk into the country with impunity every month, which is, of course, what's happening. But don't for a moment think that this is just some rushed, bungled memo incinerating abandonment of the U.S. Embassy. State Department diplomats have been preparing this move all summer under cover of a highly sophisticated deflection operation on their Kabul Twitter feed. Quote, the month of June is recognized as LGBTI Pride Month. The United States respects the dignity and equality of LGBTI people and celebrates their contributions to the society. We remain committed to supporting civil rights of minorities, including alphabet persons. Hashtag Pride 2021, hashtag Pride Month. Yes, Stein comments, I do hope they've managed to evacuate the embassy's alphabet people flag before the sacking commences. One of the depressing aspects of the swamp is that everything becomes a racket, including even your armed forces. Look at that buffoon at the top right, the guy who heads the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Thoroughly Modern Milley. That's an awful lot of chest ribbonry for a nation that hasn't won a war in 3/4 of a century. During his recent wokier-than-thou congressional testimony on white rage, I wish someone would have asked Thoroughly Modern what they were all for. Well, this is for Korea, Vietnam, the small ribbons for the Jimmy Carter helicopters in the desert fiasco, because that went tits up far quicker than it usually takes. Here's the Pentagon Female Empowerment Award I got for introducing Take Your Child Bride to Work Day to Jalalabad. This one's from the Association of Non-Binary Staff Colleges for most transitions in a single battalion. Oh, and this most recent one is for getting into a Twitter spat over Tucker Carlson. If you don't have total contempt for Millie and the rest of the brass right now, you're part of the problem. I've said for years, Stein continues, into the void of silence for Bill Kristol, Max Boot, and the rest of the shock and awe crowd on the laughably misnamed national security right, that the entire American way of war needs rethinking. I did it on Fox just a month ago. We mentioned General Milley on White Rage at the top of the show. That's not the most dispiriting remark by an American general in recent days. That award would have to go to the NATO commander supervising our exit from Afghanistan from the Daily Mail. General Austin Scott Miller, commander of U.S. and NATO troops in Afghanistan. NATO troops. What on earth could Afghanistan have to do with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? But General Miller said that he was shocked by how quickly the Afghan National Army had surrendered to the Taliban. I don't know whether he's a 3-star, 4-star, 137-star general, but a guy who professes to be shocked by how quickly the Afghan National Army is surrendering to the Taliban has no business being a general at all. Yes. And moving on, there's a good piece in American Greatness by Paul de Quinoy, The Woke Road to Kabul. The Taliban's triumphant road to Kabul is paved with woke intentions. If stagflation, rising urban crime, and a weak Democratic president did not remind us enough of the 1970s, we now have our very own fall of Saigon. The Biden administration rushed in 3,000 and 5,000, that's 6,000 troops to cover a helter-skelter airlift of U.S. personnel and vulnerable Afghan allies, so numerous that video shows them trying to hold on to C-17 military transport planes rather than the traditional helicopters. Should we blame our shifty military, security, civil society, and media elites who systematically lied about their supposed achievements in order to keep a gravy train of budgets, grants, and consultancies flowing in what they hoped would be in perpetuity? Do we drag elderly neoconservatives out of their worthless think tanks and ridiculous Weekly Standard successor publications to berate them for thinking they could create a Madisonian democracy by loudly declaiming the Federalist Papers into the caves of Tora Bora? Plenty of blame to go round. Oh, yes. Is it any wonder that Ross Wilson, now in his final hours as our acting ambassador in Kabul, and arguably one of the most inept diplomats in American history, could spend the last 10 days tweeting appeals to the Taliban to respect human rights, while professorially cautioning that their violent ways have never been sustainable forms of governments and will lead them only to international isolation? His boss, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, hummed the same tune, less than heroically tweeting that he found reports of Taliban mass killings to be, quote, deeply disturbing, unquote. Yeah. Thomas Fleming weighs in, the longtime former editor of Chronicles magazine, now leads something called the Fleming Foundation. Here's a rather despairing piece yesterday called Let's All Blame Biden and Feel Good About Ourselves. Biden's performance as commander-in-chief is disastrous, but never let us forget that George Bush and his team of aspiring world controllers had no valid reason for invading and destroying this rotten country, as I said before the invasion. And the only exit strategy that seemed likely is what is happening now. And don't shed too many tears for the Afghan turncoats who sold themselves to the U.S. If you ask servicemen stationed there, you will hear hair-raising tales of the violence and depravity and corruption of our allies in the police and military. There is nothing in Afghanistan for the American people. The only commodity worth stealing is the opium, and under our rule, the CIA and its allies have boosted opium production. One would like to think that Americans, impenetrably dumb as they are, might learn from this disastrous experiment in imperialism, but of course they will not. Republicans blame Biden, Democrats blame Trump. The ugly truth is a majority of American voters seem to approve of this evil and unjust war, and no one appears willing to take responsibility for it. Here's a piece today. Divide and Rule, Part 1, a little background. Now, you want a quotation? This is a good one. I have seen a great deal of your government since I came to India. Your forts, your arsenals, your ships, all are admirable. I have been down to Calcutta and have been astonished with your wealth, your palaces, your marts, and your mint. But to me, the most wonderful thing of all is that so wise and wealthy a nation could have ever entertained the project of occupying such a country as Kabul, where there is nothing but rocks and stones. With these words, Amir Dost Muhammad bade farewell to the British Governor-General of India at the end of the First Afghan War, 1839 to 42. Muhammad had spent much of his life fighting to preserve his kingdom. His elder brother, Fateh Khan, had been assassinated by Mahmud Shah Durrani, the very ruler of Afghanistan he had restored to his throne. As the leaders of the Barakzai tribe, Fateh Khan's brothers had to seek vengeance. They drove Mahmud from his throne and parceled out his territories among themselves. Muhammad received Ghazni, to which he later added Kabul, but his troubles had only begun. Yes, and people have been fighting over this barren country, well, for millennia. I mean, Alexander the Great even took it. And then, as Fleming notes, his successors wisely decided to depart. And a similar piece, I suppose. Actually, this is quite a good one from Michael Anton in The American Mind, Afghanistan, Doomed from the Start, 20 Years of Ruling Class Failure. The mission that the United States, or to be more precise, the George W. Bush administration, set for itself in Afghanistan was doomed from the beginning. It declared unrealizable goals, which experience quickly showed were unrealizable. And then instead of learning from that experience, doubled and tripled down over and over, and not just the Bush administration, but the entire bipartisan foreign policy establishment. If the hoary cliche is true, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, then American policy in Afghanistan over the last 20 years is a textbook example. Now, Anton approves of the Americans smashing the Taliban after 9/11, but argues against the occupations. The administration compounded or justified the Wilsonian error by talking itself into drawing the wrong lessons from World War II. Instead of seeing the outcome of that conflict for what it was, a unique, anomalous event in world history, they concluded that the rebuilding of Germany and Japan retroactively justified the prior destruction, that the only way to prevent future war was similarly to remake in our own image any country with which we came into conflict, and that such remaking would be possible anywhere with anyone. In other words, they talked themselves into believing that the one-off events of 1945 to 50 could and must be infinitely repeatable everywhere. The problem with this, as a few intellectuals, as Stanley Kurtz tried to tell them and us, I served on the National Security Council staff from 2001 to 2005, was that while pre- and interwar Germany and Japan were not democratic, they possessed many features that support advanced democracy, including civic institutions, strong and pervasive education systems, first world infrastructure, and functioning industrial economies, among others. Democratizing these countries was thus much more within the realm of possibility, especially after they had been utterly defeated and occupied. Yes, that is something to keep in mind, that Churchill, who was a brutal man, gloated that by the end of the war, the British bombing was simply making the rubble dance in Germany. That is. Modern Americans are endlessly told to celebrate diversity, but they're also hectored to treat other people as if they are changeable, interchangeable, all behave in the same ways and want the same things. This bedrock assumption of woke America is the ultimate shoal on which the Afghan war foundered. To express any doubt that a fundamentally pre-modern people with an entirely different experiences and expectations from a State Department bureaucrat or NGO do-gooder especially to suggest that democracy might not be an easy sell in the Hindu Kush was instantly to expose oneself to the charge of racism or Islamophobia. The few who dared quickly learned not to. The rest did not dare, or else were true believers from the get-go. What first was deemed unsayable soon became unthinkable. Since it was racist to see Afghanistan as it actually is, it soon became obligatory to see it as the exact opposite. Once making policy based on reality becomes racist, the only option is to make policy based on unreality. The result, in this case, 20 years, $2 trillion, 2,500 American deaths, and 20,000 more casualties, all for nothing. Michael Anton concludes, the end result is a humiliation far greater than Vietnam, where America actually had some, mostly unheralded success, and which, at least in the context of the Cold War, could plausibly be defined as a vital interest. Studying that earlier conflict, one finds, in addition to the well-known manifest blunders, reasons for the decisions made, not all of them stupid. Surveying the Afghan war, one sees only debilitating and continuous folly at every stage, at every level. This should be the end of our rotten ruling class. That it will not be shows beyond a shadow of a doubt how corrupt our country is. Oh, yes, and let's get to the refugees. I mentioned the Somalis earlier, and now we're going to have many, many, many more Afghans. And I suppose the Liberal Party in Canada and the Conservative Party are jousting as to who's going to be nicer to the refugees, who's going to take more in. Where are these people going to be housed, and at whose expense? We have a housing crisis, but no, we need 400,000 more people every year in Canada, so we can stack them up in boxes. And Michelle Rempel, Calgary MP, and Poppers aficionado. This is the woman who a couple of years ago was demanding that the Canadian government prioritize the importation of Yazidis, who are Stone Age devil worshippers. It's exactly the kind of people that we want in Canada, but we're going to get them, like it or not. John Derbyshire writes at VDARE, 100,000 Afghan refugees come here. Why not settle them amid co-ethnics in the stands? Well, because that would be too reasonable. Because they're going to enrich us with their delicious food. I have no idea what that is, but I'm sure it's very exotic and very delicious. This is from Joshua Kaplan at Breitbart. Gavin Newsom welcomes Afghan refugees to California. We're a state of refuge. Yeah, a state of refuge for, I don't know, Silicon Valley billionaires and for the rabble of the world, but not for Americans. And I guess it's kind of dangerous to talk in this manner. Jack Hadfield at National File. Twitter suspends Jenna Ellis for criticizing Biden administration plan to fly in Afghanistan refugees. Yeah, of course. They're the bestest people on earth. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. Seth Dillon comments, Twitter has suspended Jenna Ellis for violating the hateful conduct policy, with a tweet below. Which I'm not going to repeat here. Everything we know about this is that it's going to be disastrous. But apparently we have to do it anyway. As Anton says, when you reject reality as the basis for decisions, you have to base your decisions on unreality. This is from back on August the 1st from Kurt Zindulka at Breitbart. An average of 2 women or girls is being gang raped in Germany per day, with foreigners making up half of all perpetrators, according to data from the nation's equivalent to the FBI. The horrific statistics were revealed by the German daily tabloid Bild Zeitung. which reported that half of all suspects in gang rape cases were not German citizens and that often the perpetrators came from Islamic countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Afghani migrants were said to be particularly overrepresented in the gang rape statistics. While migrants from Afghanistan made up only 0.3% of the population, they accounted for 6% of all suspects. In 2018, most of the rapes occurred while the migrants were applying for asylum in that country. And meanwhile, Sweden has stopped all deportations to Afghanistan and has released some migrants who were set for deportation back into Swedish society. And diversity. How about Bachabazi? You ever heard about that? The T-boys, the dancing T-boys who become the sex slaves of old men. I suppose Canada, the United States could use some of that diversity. This is a piece that was published in 2017 by James Bovard at The Hill. Hang on just a sec. Americans are rightly outraged over revelations that Congress spent $17 million since 1997 to pay off and muzzle victims of congressional sexual misconduct and other abuses. But the U.S. government has spent vastly more, effectively bankrolling far more worse sexual atrocities in Afghanistan in brazen violation of U.S. law. Since 2002, remember this is written in 2017, the U.S. has spent more than $70 billion financing Afghan security forces, including the Afghan military and police. A law sponsored by Senator Patrick Leahy prohibits the Pentagon from bankrolling any foreign military units if there is credible information that the unit has committed a gross violation of human rights. The U.S. government has long known that U.S.-funded Afghan units routinely engage in Bachabazi boys play. Afghan military commanders and police kidnap boys and use them as sex slaves. American troops have complained of seeing boys chained to beds and hearing their screams at night. As Aaron McLean, who served in Afghanistan with the Marines, observed, the Taliban have long used reports of rapes committed by government agents as a recruiting tool. Indeed, among the elements of Mullah Omar's rise to power was his reputation for taking violent action against those who kidnapped and raped children. The Pentagon ignored the abuse until a 2015 New York Times expose of American soldiers who were punished for protesting atrocities against young boys. The Times reported that U.S. troops were confounded that instead of weeding out pedophiles, the American military was arming them in some cases and placing them as the commanders of villages and doing little when they began abusing children. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest responded to the Times bombshell. The United States is deeply concerned about the safety and welfare of Afghan boys who may be exploited by members of the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces. Protecting human rights, including by countering the exploitation of children, is a high priority for the U.S. government. Again, the wonders of diversity. Justin Trudeau commits to resettling 20,000 Afghans. Oh, and yes, a Winnipeg man. Let's hear from a Winnipeg man. Former NATO advisor, Winnipegger, working tirelessly to get former colleagues out of Afghanistan. Winnipegger, eh? Winnipegger Zobardine was a NATO advisor for a decade in Afghanistan and is now trying to get friends and former colleagues out of the country. A Winnipeg man who spent a decade working in the country is trying to get hundreds of friends and former colleagues out of life. Working in the country? Doing what? Sounds very much like a spook, does it not? Zobardine, a former NATO advisor and political analyst who was born in Afghanistan, says he is afraid for the safety of many people he knows in the country who work with NATO forces as well as other foreign aid and civil society workers. Yes, so we're going to get chain migration to the United States and Canada, and family reunification means that we will be importing whole villages from Afghanistan, assuming the Taliban lets them out. This is a pathetic story. Penny Starr in Breitbart. The return of the radical Islamist Taliban to power in Afghanistan on Sunday which has brutally persecuted alphabet people throughout its history, calls into question President Joe Biden's commitment to that community, which his administration has repeatedly touted. That's a shame. Oh, by the way, the Canadian government is going to be prioritizing the importation of alphabet people from Afghanistan. And yes, I was waiting for this, and my wait has been rewarded. What do the most powerful people on earth think about what's happened in Afghanistan? This is from Sam Raskin of the New York Post. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle said Tuesday they were devastated and left speechless by the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan and President Biden's withdrawal of U.S. troops. The world is exceptionally fragile right now, as we all feel the many layers of pain due to the situation in Afghanistan. We are left speechless, the Megxit duo wrote. They put out a communique next to a picture of them smiling inanely with Megan Mertz with some sort of inane slogan on a t-shirt. Yeah. Heading briefly to Canada, Canadian political reporting is worthless, but I can commend a piece published in the Globe and Mail by John Ibbotson pointing out, which no one else seems to be interested in, that Justin Trudeau represents a radical departure in Canadian politics because the state must become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and take on more and more and more responsibilities. That Canada is apparently going to spend itself rich. And that Trudeau the other day, in a campaign ad, we have an election going on in Canada, said that Canada needs to be bigger, to be relentless. Relentless, huh? Yeah, well, as I say, I don't really think that Canada is going to be around by 2030. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. Washington Post Jennifer Rubin celebrates demographic decline of white Americans as fabulous news. Yes, going back to Michael Anton. You know that thing that they said wasn't happening? Well, it is, and it's a good thing that it is. Washington Post journalist Jennifer Rubin celebrated the fact that the white population in America has fallen for the first time since 1790 as fabulous news. A more diverse, more inclusive society. This is fabulous news, she remarked on Twitter. A more diverse, more inclusive society. Now we need to prevent minority white rule. This is rank ingratitude. The Jews have flourished in America as they have never flourished anywhere else in the world, and they have done so under the protection of Christians who are now to be demonized by her. If you go to her Twitter feed, oh yes, we can have the Christians running thing. As Chris Menahan notes, Rubin had previously enthusiastically shared a tweet by fellow Post columnist Max Boot, crazy name, crazy guy, which asserted that the Trump era will be seen as a sad last gasp of white resistance and that hardworking Latin American illegal immigrants should replace contemptible Republican cowards in order to enhance America's greatness. Yes, as I like to say, the Soviet Union did not send us its best. Kathy Young, or a Katerina Jung, is another one of these, swearing foully at a Tucker Carlson. How dare he not want America to be enriched by Afghans? Now, these Afghans are going to be Sunni Muslims. I would say almost to a man. They have never even seen a Jew in their life, but that doesn't stop them from hating them with a passion. These people like Max Boot and Jennifer Rubin, do they not understand that the people that the United States is importing are either indifferent to Jews or hostile to them? If one looks at the attitudes of Mexicans, to give one example, Mexicans are not all that fond of the Jews. And of course, Jennifer Rubin, yes, wants to replace Americans with hard-working Latin American newcomers. How do you know which ones are going to be hardworking? The ones who don't even speak Spanish? The ones with IQs of 80? Is there a shortage of dishwashers in the United States? Watson continues, the media routinely claims that expressing concern over the demographic decline of white people is a dangerous conspiracy theory, although it's apparently not dangerous nor a conspiracy, and is in fact a great thing when the likes of Rubin and Boot are celebrating it. Back in 2015, Joe Biden also welcomed the demographic thinning of white people. By 2017, those of us of European stock will be an absolute minority in the United States of America, Biden said, adding that that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing because it means the country is becoming more diverse. Well, when people talk about diversity, what they mean is fewer white people. Yeah. Steve Saylor says, forget that stuff in the preamble about the point of the Constitution being general welfare of ourselves and our posterity. That got abrogated by Emma Lazarus's poem. Another man who is quite thrilled by this is Charles M. Blow, opinion columnist at the New York Times, and a man who genuinely seems to hate white people with a passion. It doesn't seem to have occurred to Charles M. Blow that, well, to give one example, that Mexicans have ethnically cleansed Black people from their historic neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Yes, for some of us, he writes in the Times, the census data released Thursday was fascinating. For others, it was, I would presume, downright frightening. Much of what we have seen in recent years, the rise of Donald Trump, xenophobia, and racist efforts to enshrine or at least extend white power by packing the courts. You don't know what packing the courts means, you moron. And suppressing minority votes has been rooted in a fear of political, cultural, and economic displacement. Yes, why would anyone fear being displaced? Displacement is wonderful. Much of what the white power acolytes saw this train approaching from a distance, the browning of America, the shrinking of the white population, and the explosion of the non-white, and they did everything they could to head it off. Imagine that, acting on behalf of their own people. They tried to clamp down on immigration, both unlawful and lawful. They waged a propaganda war against abortion, and they lobbied for traditional family values in the hopes of persuading more white women to have more babies. They orchestrated a system of mass incarceration that siphoned millions of young marriage-age men, disproportionately Black and Hispanic, out of the free population. Oh, are we going to talk about Joe Biden's role in that? Are we going to talk about Bill Clinton's sister soldier moment? No, apparently not. They refused to pass gun control laws as gun violence disproportionately ravaged Black communities. Yes, we've got to love that passive language. These guns are just out of control, leaping out of people's pockets and shooting everyone in sight. Oh, and there's railing against the Sun Belt here, the South, where, evil white people live. As the non-white population grows in these states, so does their political power. In response, many of these states now are trying to suppress non-white votes. That's not true, but never mind. This is why the Democratic-controlled Senate's inability and unwillingness to alter the filibuster to pass voter protection is so maddening. Republicans' voter suppression is an all-out attempt to shore up white power and diminish non-white power, and the Senate has been letting them do it. The passage of power is not a polite and gentle affair like passing the salt at the dinner table. People with power fight, sometimes to the end, to maintain it. There's going to be a shift, but not without strife. I wonder how many white people need to be eliminated for Charles M. Blow to be happy. Interesting question. And, oh, yes, more on that subject. This is from Paul Kersey at VDare. The Great Replacement is not only real, but celebrated with cheers on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. No, not just cheers, but wild applause. Yes, The Great Replacement was greeted with wild applause on the Jimmy Fallon hosted Tonight Show. It went from conspiracy theory to late-night punchline, complete with mandatory applause now signage and an audience more than eager to shower the news of whites' impending minority status in the USA with joy. Well, Jimmy Fallon may soon be smiling out of the, or smirking rather, out of the other side of his face. This is from August 12th, Priscilla DeGregory and Natalie O'Neill at page 6 of the New York Post, Horatio Sands groomed, sexually assaulted underage fan at Saturday Night Live party, according to a lawsuit. And who else was around at the time? In September 2001, Sands allegedly invited the complainant to an SNL party where she drank beer with hard-partying former SNL actor Jimmy Fallon, Sands, and other NBC bigs, according to the lawsuit, which doesn't name Fallon as a defendant. Plaintiff sat with Jimmy Fallon and others in a VIP area, ordered and consumed a Budweiser beer in the presence of NBC SNL employees, the suit states. So this happened 20 years ago, and we're only hearing about it now. There's a reason for statute of limitation laws. But this is all going to be terribly embarrassing to Jimmy Fallon, who you remember hosted Donald Trump near the beginning of his campaign. It was very friendly to him. And then, it was made clear to him that you did a very bad thing and you're going to have to grovel for it. And grovel he did, and grovel he continues to do. Let's go back to Joseph Tainter in his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, which was published in 1988 by Cambridge University Press. A Minoan Civilization. The Minoan Civilization of Crete was the first in Europe. The earliest palaces on the island were built soon after 2000 BC. They were thereafter repeatedly destroyed by earthquakes, and up to the final collapse, were each time rebuilt more splendidly than before. The Minoans possessed advanced knowledge of architecture, engineering, drainage, and hydraulics. The palace of Nasos after 1700 BC was more luxurious than the contemporary palaces of Egypt and the Near East. It contained water-flushing latrines and a drainage system. Rich frescoes adorned many walls. There were craft production rooms for potters, weavers, metal workers, and lapidaries. Palaces functioned as administrative centers, as warehouses, and as controlling nodes in the economy. They contained large numbers of storerooms and storage vessels, Nasos alone having the capacity to hold more than 240,000 gallons of olive oil. There was administrative writing. Records included the contents of armories and indicate that goods were directed to the palace and from there redistributed. The Feistos Disk is the oldest known example of printing being made from movable type impressed into the clay. The Minoans traded widely about the Mediterranean, particularly the eastern half. They were most likely the major sea power of the time. For most of Minoan history, Crete seems to have been peaceful, for the palaces were unfortified and the scenes on the frescoes peaceful. Around 1500 BC, however, a powerful earthquake caused widespread destruction, and thereafter there were major changes. An earlier script, undeciphered but known as Linear A, was replaced by the Greek Linear B. New methods of warfare were introduced, involving new kinds of arms and the horse. The Mycenaean civilization of mainland Greece became a serious trade competitor. Security declined as militarism increased. The central and eastern parts of Crete, and possibly the whole island, may have come under the domination of Nasos. Many palaces were devastated. At places like Feistos, the local governor had to report agricultural and industrial production in detail to Nasos. Around 1380 BC, the Cretan palaces were finally destroyed. Most were not rebuilt. Minoan civilization collapsed. Political, economic, and administrative centralization declined. A late reduced administration at Nasos and some other sites finally ended around 1200 BC. And on to the Mycenaean civilization. The Mycenaean civilization of mainland Greece began to develop around 1650 BC. It reached the height of its power and prosperity after 1400 BC, following the Minoan collapse. Throughout central and southern Greece, there developed a great deal of homogeneity in such things as art, architecture, and political organization. This region was divided among a number of independent states, which were each centered on a fortified palace or citadel complex headed by a single ruler. Mycenae itself is the most famous of these and was probably the most powerful. Nobles made up the royal court and administration. Major landholders, lesser nobles, administered estates in the countryside. The Linear B tablets from Pylos indicate that this kingdom was divided into 16 administrative districts, each controlled by a governor and deputy. Mycenaean palaces, like their Cretan counterparts, served as controlling economic centers at which goods and foodstuffs were stored and redistributed. Much of the Linear B writing was devoted to the accounting needs created thereby. The art and architecture of the Mycenaean civilization are widely known. Major structures were built with massive cyclopean walls. Palaces contained frescoes and bathrooms. Gem cutting, metalwork, and pottery making were carried out by skilled artisans, as was inlay and work in ivory, glass, and faience. Very often, these artisans worked under the close supervision of a palace authority. Roads, viaducts, and aqueducts were built. Mycenaean wares were traded widely about the Mediterranean. After about 1200 BC, disaster struck. Palace after palace was destroyed. There followed a period of more than 100 years of unstable conditions, repeated catastrophes afflicting many centers, and movement of population. The uniform Mycenaean style of pottery gave way to local styles that were less well executed. Metalwork became simpler, writing disappeared. The craftsmen and artisans seem to have been everywhere vanished. Fortifications were built across the isthmus of Corinth and at other places. At Mycenae, Tiryns, and Athens, water sources were developed within the citadel, cut through solid rock at great labor. The rock cut well at Athens, at least, seems to date to the time of the Troubles. Trade dropped off, and one author has suggested that the subsequent preference for iron implements was due to a sharp decline in copper and tin trade. The number of occupied settlements dropped precipitously from 320 in the 13th century BC to 130 in the 12th and 40 in the 11th. In some areas, such as the southwest Peloponnese, settlement increased at this time, and it seems that some of the people of the devastated regions may have migrated to less troubled areas. Yet only a small part of the population loss can be accounted for in this way. Estimates of the magnitude of overall population decline range from 75 to 90%. Even areas that escaped devastation, such as Athens, suffered ultimate political collapse by 1050 BC. Mycenaean civilization, despite brief local resurgences, was everywhere gone, and the Greek Dark Ages had begun. Back to Tainter tomorrow, we will talk about the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Oh, some breaking news from Citizen Free Press. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who is fully vaccinated, tests positive for COVID. And that's because the vaccine is just so very efficacious. From the Post-Millennial, Angelo Isidoro, Chicago announces indoor mask mandate for everyone, including vaccinated, because the vaccines are just so very efficacious. And there's a picture of Mayor Beetlejuice wearing, with her traditional scowl, wearing a mask that says "Stay home" on it. Whatever has happened to New Zealand, I wish I could remember who said this, but someone remarked about its Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, that she's one of these girl boss types who has never heard the word no in her life. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has mimicked Australia's top public health official by telling citizens, "Don't talk to your neighbors," after the country went into full lockdown as a result of just a single COVID case being detected. As we highlighted earlier, the entire country has been placed under lockdown for 3 days, with Auckland in lockdown for a week, following the discovery of a single coronavirus infection in the coastal town of Coromandel. Citizens are now being told to avoid work, school, and leisure activities while only venturing outside for essential reasons like purchasing food. However, Ardern went further, claiming the risk of passing on the infection was so high that people shouldn't even have conversations with their neighbors. Stay local and do not congregate. Don't talk to your neighbors. Please keep to your bubbles. We know from overseas cases of the Delta variant that it can be spread by people simply walking past one another. So keep those movements outside to the bare minimum. Wear a mask and make sure you keep up that physical distancing. Ardern is basically repeating what the Chief Health Officer of New South Wales told Australians last month. Dr. Kerry Chant said, Whilst it's human nature to engage in conversation with others, to be friendly, unfortunately, this is not the time to do that. We want to be absolutely sure that as we go about our daily lives, we do not come into contact with anyone else that would pose a risk. Why are authorities in Australia and New Zealand so insistent on people not talking to each other? Perhaps because if enough of them did, authorities would come under enough pressure to reverse the disastrous zero COVID policy, which means both countries could be under some form of on and off lockdown for years to come. And in Australia, it has been announced that no taking your mask off while drinking alcohol outdoors. Okay. I don't really know how that would work. The previously mentioned Jagmeet Singh wants to punish Canadian employees, federal employees, government employees who are not vaccinated. And Trudeau has threatened punishment. Aaron O'Toole, the Conservative leader, for now is saying that he is against this. Don't you know there's a war on? This is from Katie Daviscourt at Post Millennial. A middle school teacher in Vancouver, Washington recently came under fire after writing a disturbing post on Facebook where she wished ill on individuals that are hesitant to receive the coronavirus vaccine. I am ready to say, let them die. Janine Coquelmo, a 52-year-old PE teacher at Weist Middle School. You make a choice to not get your shot for any reason other than a doctor's note. You should not be allowed health care. You are like the brats in class that ruin it for everyone, she added. Her comments became more extreme. In response to an individual's comment on her post, which alluded to the fact that it's wrong to wish ill on others, Coquelmo said, I have no problem with that. If we're lucky, we can cut out 30% of the population that votes the wrong way, like the Hunger Games begin. According to Janae Gomez, Chief Operations Officer at Evergreen Public Schools, the HR department is handling the situation. There's a piece by Paul Craig Roberts, which you can find at his website, paulcraigroberts.org. And I don't know how much of this I can read, but it refers to Dr. Robert Malone. He is the inventor of the mRNA technology that was used to develop the mRNA vaccine. He is a member of the establishment. He is not a kook, conspiracy theorist, or anti-vaxxer. He is so solid a member of the establishment that the Department of Defense has relied on him for years. Where Dr. Malone differs from the establishment is in his unwillingness to keep quiet when he sees that the ruling COVID narrative does not fit the facts. And from Revolver News, Navy commander warns of national security threat from mandatory vaccination. In a memorandum, apparently all American servicemen have to be double vaxxed, or I guess now triple vaxxed, since the booster shot has now been approved. If that plan goes ahead, Commander J.H. Furman warns the results could conceivably be catastrophic. The forced vaccination of all military personnel with the present COVID-19 vaccines may compromise U.S. national security due to the unknown extent of complications. Further study is needed before committing the total force to one irreversible group. Initial reports leave more concern. Well, I can't read any more about that, but you can find this at revolver.news. Presumably, a great many, significant number of members of the U.S. military will quit rather than go forward with this. Oh, perhaps the military authorities will insist on court-martialing them. The U.S. military does not court-martial many people anymore, and people who should be are simply they don't even like to give dishonorable discharges any longer. A contemptible piece by Nicole Bogart at CTV News, how the COVID-19 infodemic and conspiracy theories may influence the election. And of course, this is all manufactured consent. Why doesn't Nicole Bogart and these other people, why don't they write about what's going on in Israel right now? Because the narrative is collapsing there. It is pretty much completely collapsed. But they don't want to talk about that. And let's see. It's a good day for Vietnam analogies, says Alex Berenson at Substack. Welcome to the Tet offensive phase of the war on COVID. Yesterday, Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister of Israel, issued a stark, if unintentionally revealing warning to his country about the failure of the mRNA vaccines. As you know, if you're a regular reader, Israel is the canary in the world's coal mine for COVID and the vaccines. It vaccinated more of its citizens with the Pfizer shot more quickly than almost anywhere else. This spring, Israel's experience seemed to validate the success of the vaccines. Now it's a cautionary tale. Unfortunately, since I last wrote about it, the data has gotten much worse. The number of serious cases has risen almost 30-fold since late June. Roughly 60% of those people are fully vaccinated. Yes. And let's see the people who rail against misinformation and disinformation deal with that. Take a look at lockdown skeptics. Nothing is so permanent as a temporary Scottish government program. And this is very bad news. Alcohol. Rates of alcoholism soaring in Great Britain. Lockdown caused higher number of alcohol-specific deaths in Scotland in more than a decade in 2020. Researchers find a considerably negative effect of school closures on student achievement. The mob comes for a vaccine refuse Nick. And come with vax proof or get shot on site. Raiders set COVID rules for fans. Well, the Raiders, who went from Oakland to Los Angeles, back to Oakland, or now in Las Vegas, were famed for having the rowdiest, borderline criminal fans in the NFL. Now they're all meekly going to get jabs. Are they? It would seem that way. And let's take a look at the chat. The Chris Elliott era on Letterman was great, says Oscar Toe. I thought it was pretty good. There was, Chris Elliott did this thing where he was angry all the time. And of course, Letterman did that a lot too. He seemed to be angry. And I wondered at the time when he was on NBC whether he was actually angry, whether he was actually as big a jerk as he seemed to be playing on TV. And then in later years, we found out, yes, he actually was that big of a jerk. Chairman Dan wins the gold for most obnoxious Western politician, says Palcasso 88. Don Willis says, beautiful time to be alive. We had a good life, even with all of the excess. Remember when Letterman found that completely doped up far out dude on the street and kept having him on the show? The affluent white female liberal case for Malthusianism, asks No Sleep Till Breezewood, PA. Yeah. Oscar Toe, well, thank you for your kind comment on the video or podcast I did on Joe Dante's The Burbs. I talked about other Joe Dante films as well. You can find that at Two Kevins on YouTube. A pretty good Tony Randall imitation, I think, from me. Is Metal Mike in the house? I found Jay Leno obnoxious, but now I miss him. Well, you know, whose side was I on Jay Leno versus Letterman and Jay Leno versus Conan? I was on Jay Leno's side. You don't. Both Letterman and Conan O'Brien seem to think that, you know, they were owed taking over the Tonight Show. It was foolish of NBC to get rid of Leno. He's number one, far ahead. no, we're going to bring this guy in from 12:30 who's kind of really obnoxious and who doesn't really suit the 11:30 vibe. Actually, Jay Leno was he was quite an interesting comedian. I remember when he used to go on Letterman, and Letterman would ask him about his beefs, and he talked about circuses one day. He referred to them as syphilitic sideshows. And what was the name of that girl that fell in the well? And this became the biggest story in America. And the woman was, the girl was rescued from the well. And Leno, looking genuinely irritated, said that he just couldn't abide all this triumphalism about this, that only in America would this happen. And Leno said, obviously in Switzerland, they would say, no, we will not rescue the girl. It is not efficient, which I thought was pretty good. Elliot as Marlon Brando on Letterman was good. I was wondering with Chris Elliott why he didn't get rid of his beard. I mean, it's very difficult. If you don't have a beard and you're playing a bearded role, you can get a fake beard. But if you do have a beard and you're playing a role that is not bearded, it looks really artificial when you try to pretend that you don't have a beard. I don't know. It's a mystery to me. And what do we have here? Let's open this up. An essay about Brian Eno, visual music. Yes, a lot of essays about Brian Eno. Brian Eno, of course, is an English musician who has become, over the years, one of the most treasured Britons. He was born in 1948, and we are told that his given name, his full given name, is Brian Peter George St. John Le Baptiste de La Salle Eno. Yeah, okay. I always thought that was completely made up, and it would appear that it is, but I don't know. That was one of the, in the old days, before the internet, before Wikipedia, say, you could make up any story about yourself, and who's in a position to deny it? David Bowie was constantly, saying that he was going to appear in a movie based on something or other, and he wasn't. But this got people talking about him being in movies. I guess he wanted to be in movies, and then he was in movies. Brian Eno, who styled himself for many years just as Eno, was born in 1948. And he is one of the vast number of English rock musicians who went to art school. In his case, the Winchester School of Art. Eno is a dilettante, and I don't think that he would deny that. He doesn't really play any musical instruments, and he just does things to music. I mean, he played in the Portsmouth Sinfonia. I used to have their record, their first record, which was very amusing. The Sinfonia was a group of people who they just wanted to play, and musical ability was not really necessary. And again, this comes from an art school too, the Portsmouth School of Art. And Gavin Bryars, who was a famous composer now, was part of it. Now, they played famous pieces, but of course, you can just see them fall apart, absolutely fall apart as they are being played. And I suppose listening to the Portsmouth Sinfonia, and you can find their stuff on YouTube, it gives you an idea of what a lot of orchestras must have sounded like in the 19th and 18th century, or the early 19th century, before orchestras became professional. It was said at the time of Liszt, or Alan Walker, his biographer, said that conductor was expected to do more to get everyone to start on time and to get everyone to end on time. And so orchestral performances, particularly of difficult works, were typically shambles. But the Portsmouth Symphonia, amusingly, actually became popular, or their record did. They had a top 40 hit in the charts. Eno has been messing around with sound for a very long time. And people were very much interested, say, by John Cage, and experiments with what could be done with instruments. In Eno's case, tennis, tennis piano. And Eno owned a tape recorder, and you will find this about many musicians of the time, that a man who owned a tape recorder, or even better, 2 tape recorders, was in much demand, because recording studios are famously expensive. And, one wouldn't want to do demo recordings in a recording studio, although there used to be cheap ones for that. But Eno got dragged into the music business, and he worked as a sound man for a new band called Roxy Music. And Roxy Music was originally, it was a bizarre blend of American soul music and art music. Over the years, Roxy Music became a far more conventional band, which has its advantages and disadvantages. But the initial guitarist for Roxy Music was a fellow called David O'List, who had been with the Nice before, I guess, Keith Emerson decided that having a guitar player in the band is going to take attention away from me. I gather that O'List is a very difficult person to deal with, and eventually he got sacked by Brian Ferry, and he was replaced by Phil Manzanera, who's an exceedingly talented guitarist, but not as, say, experimental as David O'List was. Brian Eno presented a very strange figure to people, because he had long blonde hair, very long blonde hair, even as he was going bald on top. I mean, he frequently wore a beret to cover that up, to the extent of which I should mention that synthesizer player, was different than traditional synthesizer players in that he didn't use a keyboard. You see a similar thing with the synthesizer artist on a Per Ubu, and making a synthesizer into a super keyboard or super organ is perhaps not the best use of it, but that's typically how it has been used. So Eno was working on the sound for Roxy Music, and I guess it was noticed what a strange-looking fellow he was, and so he was brought on stage. Eno typically treated the sound made by the other instrumentalists to very strange and interesting effect. Unfortunately for Brian Ferry, Brian Eno was becoming as popular or more popular than him. And Brian Eno was kind of an unselfconscious weirdo. For instance, stories would appear about him recording earthworms. I don't know how one can, record an earthworm. He played what was the British synthesizer, the VCS-3, later employed by David Bowie in the late 70s. Now, Eno it's enormous. I subscribed to the British music papers at the time, New Musical Express and Melody Maker. There were enormous amounts of stories written about Brian Eno because he had more going on than just Roxy music. And I'm sure this did not sit well with Brian Ferry. Brian Eno made a record, I guess the first Frippertronics record with Robert Fripp in 1973, which was called No Pussyfooting, which is really a fascinating record with a beautiful cover. He subsequently made several albums with Robert Fripp. He got sacked by Brian Ferry after the second Roxy Music album, and he was given a solo contract by Island Records, and his first record is called Here Come the Warm Jets. It's very much let's say it's traditional but weird rock album. Brian Eno liked to play with a lot of different people. And if you look at the people he had playing on his first record, it's all over the spectrum. You had Chris Spedding, Phil Manzanera, Simon King, Bill McCormick, Robert Fripp, Busta Cherry Jones, John Wetton, Andrew Mackay, Paul Thompson, Lloyd Watson. He liked to bring together people who I suppose would not be used to playing with each other. I find it a delightful record. Of course, he even imitates the singing of Brian Ferry, a little bit of revenge there. His second album, Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, is a much more intellectual record than the first one. And you see records becoming progressively more arty. Of course, it still rocks, as they say, particularly The True Wheel and Third Uncle. There's a technique that Eno used, oblique strategies. And in one of his albums, you get a bunch of these cards. And Eno created this with a fellow called Peter Schmidt, and it's all about lateral thinking. Now, Eno has used this with many different acts, some of them liking it better than others. The musicians who played for David Bowie on his records, they would get quite irritated at this. You mean, ask your body. What does that mean? Gardening, not architecture. Are there sections? Consider it transitions. What would your closest friend do? Yes. Yeah. Gnomic is the perfect word to describe this. And Eno's third solo record, many consider it to be his masterpiece, called Another Green World. And it is artier still, and not all of that raucous, as they say. Phil Collins drummed for Brian Eno, and this is a little known fact about Phil Collins, that he's a terrible sellout. Phil Collins was one of the premier prog rock drummers of the 1970s. Of course, Phil Collins is one of those guys, and a lot of musicians are like this. They just like to play. Brian Eno was an unlikely pop star. He hired a pub rock band called the Winkies, on a tour where he suffered a collapsed lung. And it was when he was in the hospital that he, invented ambient music, if you will, or what we now consider to be ambient music. His first effort in that regard was put out by Caroline Records. Island Records put out a lot of weird records, but Caroline was the imprint for records that are even weirder. And so discrete music It contains 3 variations on the canon in D major by Johann Pachelbel, and so I suppose we can blame Brian Eno to a certain extent for the ubiquity of that piece of music. When Eno was in the hospital, he was listening to music that had a stereo set brought in, but it wasn't loud enough, and so Eno was forced to listen to it in a different way. And I guess this is what you could say about Eno's ambient work, is that it's based on his interest, his very strong interest in people appreciating music in different ways. Eno was a great fan of the burgeoning krautrock scene in the 1970s, and you see him working with Harmonia and Cluster. Oh, you see him showing up everywhere. You see him showing up with John Cale and Kevin Ayers at the Rainbow. It seemed that in the 1970s, Brian Eno had his oar in everywhere. I suppose you could say that Eno made a decision, a rather good decision, that him playing a rock star, that was not going to age well. So essentially, he stopped doing it. Before and After Science, it has King's Lead Hat on it, which is an anagram for Talking Heads, and it is less rocky than any record that he had made before, and he pretty much abandons rock music with Ambient One, music for airports, installation music. He made a record with John Cale, which I suppose was the last rock record that he made. But he has been dealing with ambient music since then, working by himself or with people like Leo Abrahams. And he has created a niche for himself. I mean, this is a man who got paid God knows how much money to come up with a sound, an opening sound for a Microsoft Windows operating system. That's a nice work if you can get it. Eno is, it is strange to me that he has become, a guru figure. I suppose one of the reasons is that there are not many people in rock music who are intelligent in the way that would, let them write pieces for The Guardian. Lots of smart people in rock music, but book smart. Well, Mark Knopfler's one, certainly, but not too many of them. It was a shock to me as a longtime King Crimson fan that I was learning more about William or Bill Bruford, the drummer, and I could hardly believe not just how posh he is, but how smart he is. And I don't mean, smart for a rock star, but genuinely smart. And, oh, yes, the Eno, of course, is a famous producer, working with David Bowie many times in the so-called, working on the Berlin trilogy, although I think Tony Visconti is rather put out that Eno has been given pride of place as producer of those records, and it was Visconti who was the primary producer, not Brian Eno, who was more the ideas man. And the band U2, I guess looking for some intellectual cred, decided to bring him in because it looks really good, because Brian Eno is so smart. I should mention that the album that Brian Eno did with Robert Calvert of Hawkwind. That's really great stuff. It's very strange. Imagine this record, Captain Lockheed and the Starfighters. It's about the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, the Widowmaker. And Robert Calvert, who was genuinely crazy, made a concept album about it. And then his second solo record, which was fully produced by Brian Eno, is about the Vikings and the Vikings colonizing North America. Calvert was a crazy genius. Eno's produced Genesis, and actually he was on the Quiet Sun album, which was one of Phil Manzanera's side projects, which was really quite a good band. And Eno has been all over the place, as a producer. He's worked with many bands that were just not just critically acclaimed, but also sold records. Of course, his work with the Talking Heads is well known. He produced Ultravox as well. And James, a quite popular band in Britain. Sinead O'Connor, Coldplay, one of my least favorite bands. Grace Jones, Paul Simon. And he worked with Coldplay as recently as 2017. Of course, now, as I say, he is known as the clever man who thinks big thoughts. And again, it's not, I never would have predicted that, back when I first heard of Eno back in 1973. But it's, I suppose this is really kind of story that could only happen in England. Unfortunately, Eno is involved in a tiresome crusade for a boycott of Israel. Again, I'll just say this. Even if one disagrees with Israel's policies, particularly with regard to Palestine, it would be absurd to make the argument that Israel is one of the worst countries on earth and must be singled out for punishment. But those are my thoughts on Brian Eno. He has produced many different kinds of music, and a great deal of it is really quite good and original as well. I mentioned just finally a band called 801, which was a prog rock supergroup, which didn't last for very long. Phil Manzanera was in it. Bill McCormick was in it. Lloyd Watson, Francis Monkman. The 801 live album, I would have to say, is recorded in 1976, is one of the greatest prog rock records ever made, right up there with Phil Manzanera's first solo record, which again is sort of super group of prog rock. Anyway, let's get back to the chat before I sign off. Lamprey Milt says Brian Eno Productions projects a majestic mysticism, making it palatable to one's psyche. U2's Octung's Baby is proof. Adrian Belew working with Eno on Remain in Light and touring with the Talking Heads. Yeah, I liked him better doing that than as a frontman for King Crimson. I'll say that. Their solo Kiss records are awful, says Metal Mike. We're talking about Kiss here. Ultravox rules. Okay. Am I the only one who preferred John Fox as the Ultravox frontman rather than Midge Ure? Talking Heads Eno collaborated for some really great albums, says Don Willis. In the UK, to have some street cred, they would bring in Brian Eno. In the US, it could be Tom Waits or Iggy Pop. Well, it's like John Cale producing Patti Smith's first record, Horses. I don't know how much producing John Cale did at that time, because he was a coked out monster for many years. He produced the first recording of, I'm trying to remember the English band, the two singer-songwriter band, Squeeze. And so they brought the songs, typical songs of that partnership. And John Cale said, no, singing about love. No, I'm not going to do that. I want you to write songs about muscle men. That's what he said to them. And I just wonder if they went to their record label and said, John Cale is a coked out monster. Could we get that Chris Thomas in here? I wonder if something like that happened. And what else do we have here? Finally, has Kevin seen flashbacks of a fool? Daniel Craig is a has-been movie star. Roxy Music, if there is something, plays a central role to the story. That's from Glib Medley. I've seen the video, or a video from it. I haven't seen the full movie, but I will have to. That is one of my very favorite songs. I tried to listen to Fripp Summers, couldn't do it, said Buddy. Yes, Chris Difford and Glenn Tilbrook. Squeeze was quite good. I thought so as well. Interestingly, their biggest hit was sung by Paul Carrack and not by them. I believe it was Glenn Tilbrook said that when they tried singing it, it sounded like the Electric Light Orchestra, and they didn't want that. Mitch was great in The Rich Kids, says Chogokin 666. I thought The Rich Kids had a lot of promise. And I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to wrap it up. And what's coming up later in the week? Well, I'll tell you what's coming up later in the week. A beautiful, heart-rending movie on Theater Thursday called Umberto D., directed by Vittorio De Sica from 1952. On the book club, an outstanding work of thought and analysis, Romancing Opiates by Theodore Dalrymple. And next week, I'm going to talk about the life and death of Art Rock. I'll be back on the air tomorrow, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you'd click on the like button, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not already done so. And if you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which would be exceedingly well appreciated at this present time and in my present condition, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to the live stream may be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And again, skill testing question, where do you live? And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.